Hello YouTubers out there, this is Jerry Saravia at the movies, our new title. Somebody told me my Natural Born Killers review, the audio was not so great, so we're going to do it again because I think I've improved the audio finally. Anyway, so let's move along here. It's been 20 years since Natural Born Killers came out, which was in August of 1994. This was Oliver Stone's controversial film about serial killers. In this case, Mickey and Mallory Knox, played by Woody Harrelson and Juliette Lewis. They go on a killing spree, and they're eventually caught and made into media darlings, as is often the case even nowadays, certainly. And there's an Australian TV host who has a big show on profiling this kind of thing, especially serial killers, and played by Robert Downey Jr. And the character's name is Wayne Gale. And his idea is that for the Super Bowl, that is an upcoming special in the Super Bowl, post the Super Bowl game, there will be this interview with Mickey Knox, and he thinks that the ratings will go through the roof, which of course they probably do. But then during the interview, they cut to commercial, and then there's a prison riot. And anyway, this was Oliver Stone's attempt to satirize the media's appetite for homicide, siding with the killers, making the killers into celebrities. Now, at that time, interestingly enough, that was seen as a bit over the top, and yet it was true, which is why at the end of the film, and by the way, there are a lot of spoilers here, so if you haven't seen Natural Born Killers, go away. And so, here we go. Okay. At the very end of the film, after Mickey and Mallory Knox, they survive the whole prison riot, blood on the walls climax. That includes a severed Tommy Lee Jones head, who plays the prison warden, by the way. There are clips of other celebrities at that time. Again, this was 1994, so we have Tonya Harding, O.J. Simpson, the Menendez brothers, etc. The idea being that the media is so devoted to focusing on these people, they lose sight of the victims. And that is a point that I think needed to be addressed. Now, in 20 years' time, Natural Born Killers is the kind of film that it grows on you. It's not a film you can easily forget. Even if you hate the film or love the film, you can't forget it. In many ways, it is at least the 1990s version of A Clockwork Orange, to a certain extent. There are some similarities. But really what the film is about is how television and the media filter their way through Mickey and Mallory Knox's subconscious. And that was the thing that I missed out on when I first saw the film. Now, I saw the film in theaters back in August of '94, and let me tell you, it was, I hated the film. But I hated the film because I couldn't focus on what was going on screen. Oliver Stone has a sledgehammer style. He always has, really. Perhaps he's been a little bit more subtle lately than he used to be, but in those days, I mean, this camera, which there's really dazzling cinematography, by the way, by Robert Richardson, who also lensed Oliver Stone's Nixon and U-Turn, and even, I think, a few films even prior to Natural Born Killers, including JFK. Anyway, the camera kind of pans up and down, and it's always these Dutch angles and canted angles, and the constant shift of different film stocks, from black and white to color to animation to 16mm to 8mm to black and white to 35mm to, I mean, it's all over the place. Now, there have been other films that have done this sort of thing, but not necessarily in the way that Oliver Stone has done it, which is that one shot that features, let's say, Juliette Lewis as she is dancing to The Way I Walk in the ultra-violent cafe scene that opens the movie. We see her in 35, we see her again in a Dutch angle, still in 35mm, and then suddenly it's, 16mm black and white. And at other times in the movie, you can see her, and then there's an animation of her self, and then it can switch to a different stock all within seconds, so that it's a constant whipping, if you like, of film stock after film stock after film stock after film stock. Camera's never really steady. It's always, again, canted angles, Dutch angles. There's a lot of it's a hyperkinetic film style, and the idea, I think, was to evoke the trauma of not just what Mickey and Mallory Knox are inducing in, towards people that they kill, but also it's a way of reflecting on their own subconscious and their childhood. And Juliette Lewis's Mallory Knox, she has visions of her father, played by Rodney Dangerfield, how he sexually abused her, and so we see a lot of that. Woody Harrelson's own Mickey Knox's father killed himself and abused his son, and his mother abused his son, and so we see that's a constant barrage. So that it's not necessarily, they're shifting points of view in the film, but when we focus on them, it's much more of a hyperkinetic crescendo of feelings and emotions. It's just, we're inside their minds, essentially. And that's what the film was about. Now, again, when I first saw the film, I hated it because I could not focus on what I was seeing. I wish I would have seen the film again in a theater. In fact, if it ever does play in the theater again, I would like to see it again to see if I feel the same way, because you watch something on video or DVD, unless it's a huge screen, you're not going to get the same effect, which is why films are best understood and viewed the first time out, generally speaking, in a movie theater, because that's really the way they are meant to be seen if they're made for theaters. Of course, there are movies that go directly to DVD, but so I hated the film, but it didn't escape my mind. I kept thinking about it, and I watched the Siskel and Ebert special, and they would show the clips, and I thought, there's something there. I wasn't connecting to it, and then later on I watched it repeatedly, and it's just the kind of film that maybe when you watch it on a smaller screen, you get a better idea of what it is he's trying to do, Oliver Stone. The film, of course, is based on a Tarantino screenplay, which was really all about Wayne Gale. Mickey and Mallory Knox were the supporting characters, and it was an entirely different type of script. But as Oliver Stone got involved in rewriting and seeing what was going on with the media, and the media oversaturation of glorification of killers or people that just perpetrators of violence, especially Tonya Harding. And that was a crazy year, by the way. It was a very crazy year. Same summer of Forrest Gump. And I remember one critic saying that Natural Born Killers kind of was a slap in the face of Forrest Gump. And that was the same year, of course, in September, where the month after Natural Born Killers, where we had Pulp Fiction. So, but Natural Born Killers it's clearly the kind of film that Tarantino wouldn't have made. It's not the way he sees things. He sees things in with a very ironic distance. But he's about colorful characters and colorful dialogue, but not necessarily about making a specific point. Not necessarily. Natural Born Killers is a whole different thing. I think the film is still somewhat muddled in its message, because the film is essentially a big-scale, ultra-violent cartoon in a very avant-garde style. I mean, you see this type of style in commercials. In fact, nowadays, the style of that film in JFK, you see everywhere, so that when a character is, for example, talking, and then we cut back to the character who seems mute, but the dialogue continues, and we cut back to the character still talking. That's the kind of thing you see now in commercials. TV shows, television series, everything. I think the film itself was, in fact, quite influential in that regard. But you don't see the style of the film itself today. I mean, there is no other film that has really gone that far with such a grandiose vision, like Oliver Stone had in that film. What's also interesting to me today about that film is that at that time the film was highly controversial because of the violence. I mean, what's the title of the film? After all, it's Natural Born Killers. You know, one or two people are going to die or be killed at least. And the director's cut focuses a little bit more on the black humor of the film, particularly Robert Downey Jr. when he gets shot in the hand. In the theatrical version, he's shot in the hand, but in the director's cut, you see a hole through his hand. That's a big gaping size hole, which you also see, by the way, in From Dusk Till Dawn, which is another Tarantino film, but directed by Robert Rodriguez. And Tarantino himself has a hole through his hand, and he puts duct tape around it. I always wondered, you know, did he see the director's cut and was influenced? I don't know. But anyway. But the film was criticized for the violence. And too much violence. Oliver Stone went too far. Stoned extremes, which is what I like to call it. When Oliver Stone goes too far, which is quite often. But what really is interesting now, looking back in its 20th anniversary, is that we've had a lot of violent films, but the violence in that film is clearly not even as graphic as anything you see today. And you can just look at video games. Grand Theft Auto, all of these war games, you know, World War II games, Call of Duty, that sort of thing. And that's what's interesting to me, is that television itself has also gotten quite graphic, and much more graphic than anything in that film. And yet nobody complains about it. Nobody complains about violence anymore in movies. Only occasionally does it come up. Usually Tarantino's name. He has a new movie, Django Unchained. Something happened to Sandy Hook. It's his fault, you know. But generally speaking, there is, I mean, because when that film came out, it was just a firestorm. I mean, it was insane. And people putting down the film who didn't even see it, which, you know, is that old quote where, you know, I know garbage when I see it and I don't have to see it. Well, you know, you still, you know, we're talking about a work of art. It's not, you know, just some garbage in a dumpster. So when it comes to art and you deal with these subjects, particularly film, it can be very powerful in illustrating just what's going on. And that's the thing about that movie. It really captured, in my opinion, what was really going on in 1994 and what goes on even further today, particularly with a song by Leonard Cohen about the future, which is what ends the film with that song. And he says the future is murder. And what do you hear mostly in the news today? Much more prevailing coverage of murders. Murder after murder after murder. We've heard it before, particularly in late night news, but today we have a 24-hour news cycle. So a lot of these stories are recycled in other stations and you hear about them over and over and over and over. And you get numbed by it, but I don't. And see, that's where the argument is, that Oliver Stone himself was desensitized and presented it as being desensitized to violence, that film. The violence in that film is not, it doesn't have the sting, I think, that it needed, because all of it is cartoonish. The prison riot, not so much. That's pretty strong stuff. But it doesn't have the honesty of, say, it's not honestly presented, which I think Oliver Stone was pushing not to be honest. He didn't want to be realistic. And that's fine. But I think the prison riot, in a way, was very powerful stuff. But it doesn't carry that honesty, that sting that you feel in your gut when you watch, say, a Martin Scorsese film or a Clockwork Orange. Goodfellas or Casino present violence very realistically. You don't see that in Natural Born Killers. But it's still a very good film. Much better than what I initially thought, but I think it's a film I should revisit in theaters. But here's the question. Could Natural Born Killers be made today? The answer is yes. It could be made today, I think. And probably in the same way. Would it cause any level of controversy? And the answer is no. Probably not. The most telling example as to why it's not is not just what I had mentioned before, but also take into consideration that 2 years ago, Oliver Stone came up with a film called Savages, and that film's violence is grisly, and didn't cause a stir at all. Nobody talked about it. It was almost like some film critics just thought, you know. And that's where we are today. Sex is a problem in movies, but apparently not violence. But I'd love to hear some comments out there from people about this. It's really interesting. So there I am, Natural Born Killers, a far better film than I initially thought 20 years ago. And to this day, probably more prescient than I ever imagined, which is really something to say. And this is Jerry Saravia at the movies, signing off.